And now is the time in our program where we're delighted to welcome our speaker of the morning, well known to us, Linda Mashburn, and we thank Linda so much for agreeing to do this. Linda is well known to us. She and Bill live in elder spirit. They both have the joy of music to surround them. I asked Linda if she wanted me to share anything about her specifically. And she said one of the things in her career that she was proudest about was founding a community-run rural health clinic, a rural health program in North Carolina. And it became a model for other rural health centers.
Thank you.
And the greatest part, it's 50 years old and still surviving. So yay, Linda. Thanks for doing that. We who live in rural health know the challenges. So welcome, Linda. And Linda will be talking about how do we discern truth? What tests do we use? What is the soil on which the seeds of truth fall? Linda.
Thank you. I teased that I peaked my career at age 29, and it was downhill after that. But at any rate, about truth. The subject of truth has been on our minds a lot this winter, certainly since the November election, but maybe longer than that, as some news media began tabulating the falsehoods of our past president. I stopped noticing when the number went above 20,000. To begin our discussion, I want to go back to what I think is a bit of wisdom that comes to us from a Jesus parable in Matthew 13, quoting Clarence Jordan's translation. One day a farmer went out to plant. As he did so, some of the seeds fell on the path, and the birds came along and gobbled them up. Others fell on rocky places where the soil was shallow. Because they weren't planted deep, they came up right away, but not having a deep root, they withered when the hot sun hit them. Still others fell among the weeds, which grew up and choked them out. But others fell on good dirt and matured, some multiplying 100 times, some 60, some 30. That could be a parable for how truth sometimes comes to us through millions of spoken words and similarly millions of written or read words, like seeds. Part of the soil on which we receive them is their context. Some of the soil is our relevant experiences. And some of the soil is our education, our values, our cultural background, or our spirituality. As a congregation of Unitarian Universalists, one of our core values is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And I think we realize that that search for truth impacts many other of our core values. How we go about working for justice and equity, how we pursue peace, how we work to save the environment or slow down climate change. And above all, after the events of this last January, we are very aware of how damaging can be belief in falsehoods, that violence can result from lies. But how do we discern the truth? As Eric Grossman so eloquently showed us in his talk in January, the truth is very elusive, especially on social media. But also, by the way, we are inundated with news and opinions. How do we tell the difference between facts, satire, playing with words, jokes? Unless we know the person saying the words really, really well and know what he or she intends the meaning to be. I want to offer a suggestion that came to me out of an article I read in my alumni magazine from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, which has become very interfaith, very UU since I attended back in the late 60s. The article by John Tatamanil suggests that it's necessary to add love to the equation in order to get at the truth. To quote his article, loving the truth sounds simple. It is not. It takes disciplined practice. We must see to it that the power of love overcomes in us the addiction to powers that hijack and distort desire into craving. Truth will shed her garb and show herself only to those who love. To see, to really see, one must love. Appropriate for Valentine's Day, right? So what can this mean? How to understand this? At least one initial meaning comes to me. When we have empathy for another person or a group of people, we begin to see the world through their eyes. We listen to their point of view. We walk a little bit in their shoes. President Joe Biden just suggested that in his inaugural speech. We gain a different perspective. At least for me and for my children, much of this change in perspective has come through international travel, which is a rare privilege of affluence, but one for which I am very grateful. I will never forget the changes that happened in me during my first trip to a third world country. It was after my sophomore year in college, and I was 19 years old, going to Ghana and Nigeria with 12 other college students and a leader. The trip was promoted as a work camp, and we did spend a month building a classroom block onto a secondary school in a village, along with Ghanaian students from their work camp association. However, part of the purpose of the program was to expose us to the sociological and political realities of emerging countries in Africa, coming out of a history of colonial rule. When I visited Ghana in 1961, it was 3 years into independence from Great Britain. So we had meetings with many people running departments in the government, health, education, development, etc. And we visited hospitals, technical schools, went to most parts of the country, and spent a couple nights housed in one of the slave forts that had shipped slaves to the US and England during the 17th and 18th centuries. And of course, I lived in a village for a month and spent much time with Ghanaian students my age. My perspective on many things underwent radical change. A few weeks ago, my youngest daughter called me and said, "Do you remember what we were doing 20 years ago today?" Well, hard as I thought, I couldn't answer her. The year 2000 had been a traumatic year for me. My mother had died and I was her executor. A nonprofit I was treasurer for was falling apart, the executive director having a severe mental health crisis. So I finally gave up and said, "What were we doing 20 years ago today?" She answered, "You were seeing me off on semester at sea." This was a round-the-world trip that also provided a semester's worth of college courses for participants. There were about 100 faculty and staff who accompanied the 600 students on a retired cruise ship, stopping in Cuba, Brazil, South Africa, India, Kenya, Vietnam, China, Japan, and I'm sure I'm not remembering all the ports. Some of the incredible experiences our daughter had were visiting the prison cell where Nelson Mandela was kept in South Africa, working as a volunteer at an AIDS clinic for children and babies that Mother Teresa had founded in Kenya, being adopted, as she put it, by a family in Vietnam and shown places where few tourists go, including the underground tunnels, staying in a dorm with students in Beijing and learning their views. Our daughter said again on that phone call, as she has so many, many times, "Thank you for sending me on semester at sea. It changed my life." Not all of us have the privilege of traveling around the world as my daughter and I did, but I do think our perspective doesn't change and allow us to see the truth as it is perceived by others, unless we move out of our comfort zones into somebody else's reality for a time. So it doesn't have to involve money or international travel. Probably the first time I seriously left my comfortable suburban middle-class existence was the summer after my high school graduation, when an older friend, then in college, asked me to join her in working for the summer in some inner city churches through the Presbytery of Chicago. The job involved working with local church leaders at predominantly Black churches to run vacation Bible school programs. Since I was assigned to work with kindergarten-age children, this was mainly a job of recreation and crafts. The big hitch was that after the morning program was over, we were expected to visit all the families of our students and invite them to an end of the school program. So for 6 weeks that summer, I spent my afternoons walking the streets of Chicago ghettos, going up dark, smelly stairs in tenement buildings to visit all these families, mainly mothers. And did I learn? I frequently found after climbing up the stairs that I would be invited into a beautifully furnished, immaculate apartment and treated to very gracious hospitality. So by the end of the summer, I fully understood the limitations that had been placed in Chicago on Black home ownership, a new truth for me. And I hadn't understood the extent to which segregation was practiced in the city. I had gone to an integrated high school until a team member pointed out that we had probably integrated one of the beaches in Chicago for the first time after our group of college students had gone there on a free afternoon. I think it was helpful to my children's education that I often took them along when I volunteered at a homeless shelter while they were growing up. They got to know personally some of the chronically homeless folk in our community and grew to enjoy some of the family traditions we established at the shelter, like helping the residents trim their Christmas tree and providing refreshments and music for carols afterward. All three of our children spent some time in Central America. Of course, one step I made out of my comfort zone was the largest step for me, going well beyond the experience of a foreign country. That was the 3 months I spent in a federal prison. The truths I learned about our justice system or injustice system, and the compassion I witnessed among my fellow prisoners will always be part of the understanding I gained. Some of you know that I have close friends living and doing development work in Nicaragua. One of them spoke here a few years back about their work. Another friend there writes a weekly blog and was also discussing the subject of truth this past January. She said, and I'm quoting, "When you don't go very far from your home, your truth is that the earth is flat and the sun does the moving around the earth. But we have learned a different reality with the help of many." Unquote. She follows with another example of enlightenment that many have witnessed. Quote, "In my lifetime, lesbians and gays hid their sexual preferences, and some still do in open societies, while in closed societies like Russia, these people must hide or be tormented and jailed. But when gays and lesbians started coming out and being truthful about who they were, those of us straight saw that they were our sons and daughters, our sisters and brothers, our parents, our friends, and our leaders. What we might have thought before in our ignorance was sinful or unhealthy, we now began to see the truth, the normality. My nephew couldn't go home for 20 years after he came out, after I said the normality, end of quote of my friend. Now I'm speaking in my own voice. My nephew couldn't go home for 20 years after he came out of the closet as a gay young man when he was in college. So he frequently spent holidays and vacation time with our family while our children were growing up. It makes a difference to children to understand some things at an earlier age. Part of the reason my friends write a weekly blog from Nicaragua is to counter some of the constant misinformation that so easily spreads. For example, we may think that all Central Americans are crowding our southern border as refugees, but Nicaraguans are not. We may think that COVID has run rampant through poor countries where poor housing and crowded slums are prevalent, but Nicaragua, second poorest country in our hemisphere, has one of the lowest rates in both North and South America because testing has been excellent, as has contact tracing, along with universal free health care. So their numbers of COVID infections and deaths have been far, far better than ours. So empathy, compassion, the ability to walk in another's shoes, or to say a well-used word on this Valentine's Day, love, helps us discern the truth. However, maybe I ought to ask one more question. We might all agree that suffering has maybe made President Biden more empathetic than his predecessor. But is suffering necessary to gain that kind of perspective on the truth? Must one lose family members to COVID to respect the truth about masks and distancing? I sincerely hope not, because I don't think anyone wants to experience loss or death, no matter what the reward in knowledge or wisdom. However, if we look back on our lives, we will discern moments that were painful, where we struggled against physical pain, or in some ways more traumatic, emotional pain. Did it make us wiser, more sympathetic to others who might be in a similar situation? Again, I can only speak from a personal experience. And on the larger scale of world trauma and loss, it can seem very trivial because it didn't involve death, illness, loss, or any of the great traumas that life inflicts on people. But for me at 11 years old, it had a profound effect. My family moved from suburban St. Louis to suburban Chicago when I was 11. My older brother was starting his senior year in high school and was a very shy guy. So the family worried about his adjustment. However, I was more of an extrovert, had lots of friends, and my parents were sure I would adjust to the move easily. Well, as it turned out, in the weeks before the move, a girl from my brother's new high school moved into his class in the old high school and proceeded to call her friends, telling them to look out for my brother and make him feel at home. They did just that, making him double date with them, involving him in a church youth group and clubs. My brother's senior year was the most social of his life. On the other hand, I struggled. The sixth grade girls I encountered in my new school thought my clothes babyish, and I didn't even turn my socks the right way. Those clothing symbols, as Paul Blaney explained just last week, were very important for acceptance to 11-year-old girls. I endured 6 months in a new school without a single friend and was the brunt of all the classroom jokes while I struggled to catch up academically. My mother valiantly tried to find me hand-me-downs that would make me look more acceptable. But even after I had an improved wardrobe, the damage was done. I was a social outcast. Luckily, the next year, all of us sixth graders transferred to a consolidated middle school, and I found that there were more than half a dozen similarly unpopular girls from other elementary schools who would talk to me and be friends with me. So I finally had a group of friends, the least popular girls in the 7th grade of a consolidated middle school. You might ask what difference or wisdom does that kind of rejection impart? And it's easy for me to answer. Being a total social outcast, even if it was only for 6 months, and then for a couple of years, part of the lowest social group in a middle school, made me sympathetic to and aware of others' outcast status. Since I had been so quickly judged by my appearance, it let me know permanently that I should not similarly judge others by appearance. It gave me an early awareness of racism, the problems of disabled persons, and sympathy for the lower income members of my school classes whose families couldn't afford the going fashions or fads. Later on, it made me sensitive to my children's need to fit in with the clothes they wore. So during some years when I wasn't working outside the home due to the need of our adopted son to catch up 6 years of missed education, I bought no-name sneakers, as my kids called them. But I carefully cut off the Keds label from some ancient worn-out shoes and glued them onto the new cheap sneakers so my children wouldn't be as ridiculed as I had been. Finally, I want to end by suggesting that the opposite of truth and love is fear. When we are fearful, we close ourselves off to new experiences or to reading things that might shake a belief. If we really want to pursue truth, we need to be open to new experiences, to new people, to new ideas, to love, living, and learning. I will hope that whatever suffering or trauma all of us have experienced in our lives does not make us fearful. So what kind of soil are you preparing for the millions of words, ideas, messages you receive every day from the world around you? Do you have rocks that the falsehoods bounce off of? Do you have enough empathy so it chokes out other falsehoods? Do you have a rich soil of experiences that let you walk in another's shoes for a different perspective? And on this Valentine's Day, do you have enough love that it helps you discern the truth from the lies? And that concludes what I have to say.